1,
2,
3, let's go!
So I want to cover what is a passive house, what values do we have that made it so we wanted to build passive, and then what are the benefits of building a passive house. I also wanted to make this video from the perspective of the home builder. I've seen a ton of different videos on YouTube. I scoured everywhere for them on the how of building a passive house. How to make the walls, like how to do the foundation, all those things. And those are important and we're gonna cover those. But this is more from the perspective of a homeowner. So if you're a potential passive house homeowner, why you should demand this type of house, what makes it great, and why it's worth the additional investment at this time to build these houses now. One of my main motivations for creating this channel and sharing all of this, the process of building this house, is because it was the kind of content I was looking for before we got started. A lot of the videos that I saw were people either taking, 2 or 3 years to build their own house, or it were people that, were having like a model home built for, a proof of concept for the idea of a passive house. And I thought that there was an opportunity to have it for just, a person who was, working full time, didn't have the capacity or time to build a passive house on their own, or wanted, to have that type of a home. Building passive is a really large topic, so there's a ton of different variables that go into how you make a passive house. So as an example, if you're building a house in Los Angeles, that's going to be a very different house than if you're building a house in Denver. Or if you're building a house in Denver, that will even be a meaningfully different house than how you would build in a place like Alaska. So there's a lot of different variables, both location, the lot that you have, the available resources that you have, all of these go into dictating how you should build and what this passive house is going to look like. I'm going to be showing you a way to build a passive house with this video series. So we are in Denver, Colorado. For a cold weather area, it is a rather temperate cold area. We have lots and lots of sunshine. We have snow, but not an insane amount of snow. We can rely on sun for most of the year for heating and cooling. So our passive house will be a type of passive house with the limitations and benefits of the area that we are in. For instance, we have the opportunity to have a south-facing home. That's a very large factor in how you build your house. Because the envelope of our house is going to be so tight, and it's going to be such an airtight house with such good insulation, we don't need to have something like geothermal or something like that to help offset the heat. I wanted to set the stage a little bit for a passive house. What is a house like that was built, with standard building codes, and then how does that differ from a passive house? Most houses that are built these days are built with the minimum standing code, and you should think of your city's building code as the worst house that you are legally allowed to build. When they set those standards, they're not trying to make it so people build the best house possible or the most efficient house possible. They're saying this is the bottom level of house that we are permitting you to build. That minimum standard can be good for a lot of different reasons. You can guarantee, that, there's a certain amount of safety, inside of the house that you built, and a lot of other things. But one of the things that they're terrible at is making houses energy efficient and just, conserving the energy that the houses have. Some of the common themes that you find in houses that are built with the normal building standards are 2x4 walls. They don't really pay attention to the orientation of the home when they build them, and they have a lot of thermal bridging. So what you'll find is that there's a lot of areas where the stud of the wall is going from the outside of the house to the inside of the house, transferring that heat through that material, be it wood or some other material. You'll have really energy inefficient windows, and a lot of other problems. I didn't want to build a standard house. I've been studying this for a long time, and I wanted to build a house that would use the least amount of resources possible. Both in construction, although that's really difficult, and throughout the rest of the time that the house would be in use. This house is going to take a lot of materials, for the concrete and all of those things, but this house could last a few hundred years. And using a bit more materials up front when we're creating it for these couple years, and then having the house for the next, let's say, 198 years, use far less materials, seems to be the better approach in terms of conserving our resources and looking out for the future homeowners who are coming down the line, who will also, even though they're not paying for the initial building of the house, they will also benefit from that energy efficiency when I'm long dead, and that house is in the hands of new owners. Why don't home builders build more energy efficient houses? I think there are a couple reasons. The two most common ones are consumers are not demanding these houses. So, if I moved from Utah to Colorado, and there's neighborhoods going up in almost every city in Utah right now. And if you went and asked them what people are demanding, they're demanding, additional square footage or the third car garage or these different things. Consumers haven't gotten to the point yet where they can see that there's real energy savings to be had, and that they can live and have a very comfortable life with their families on far less resources. So right now, home builders aren't building more energy efficient homes because they're not required to, because the consumers that are purchasing these homes aren't requesting it and making it a demand. The second area that makes it so these kind of houses aren't being built, even though they're objectively better in my opinion, is that for home builders, it's more expensive to build these homes. They have to be more thoughtful. It's much more difficult. When they're building this home, all of these walls that you see over here, they're going to be about a foot thick, and they have to make an airtight barrier around them. And that's difficult for builders. It's difficult for builders to make sure that there's no perforations, in the membrane that's going around the house. And they have to be worried about every single nail they drive through or screw they drive through, and if it's puncturing, the airtight seal that the house has. So it is definitely more difficult to build these houses at this point. The second reason that these houses aren't very common yet is that cities don't demand people to build these houses. Currently, our building codes allow you to build wildly energy inefficient homes, and energy efficiency isn't really on the radar for most cities in their code. You'll find, some things in the code, that have to do with, square footage, like minimum square footage for a home. But you can put in the most energy efficient windows imaginable in most cities, and that's just fine. So those two things, what consumers are demanding, and then also what cities are requiring people to build, those are the two largest factors for why you don't see passive houses being the most common standard for building right now. Some of the lowest hanging fruit, for making your house more energy efficient is to have south-facing windows, to have large south-facing windows, and to have very, very small windows on the north side. So this is the north side of our house right here. This is the south side. This south side of the house is going to have very large, very energy efficient windows. And then this north side is just going to have, I think, 5, if I remember correctly, windows that are relatively small to lose as little heat as possible. So north-facing windows never get direct sunlight. So how you should think of a north-facing window is that you only lose heat, or whatever. If you're trying to keep the cold air out in the winter, it's letting cold air in the wintertime. If you're trying to keep hot air out in the summertime, those north-facing windows are letting hot air in. So when you're building a home, you want to orient the windows that are south-facing to gain as much sun as possible. And then if you let too much sun in the summer, that becomes a problem. In the summer, you want to keep as much direct sunlight out as possible. So in the summer, you want to have overhangs hanging over, if the house is here, you want to have overhangs hanging over so that the sun can never directly go in the winter in the summer. And then in the winter, it lets in as much light as it can in the winter time to get in as much heat into the house as possible. For certain homes, when they're trying to make a passive house, you're going to want to have thermal mass inside of the house. And thermal mass is, some heavy material, dense material usually, something like concrete or bricks or something like that, that traps in heat and lets it out slowly, and that's especially helpful in the wintertime in cold temperature areas. So for instance, if you have a large concrete floor and it's getting direct sunlight during the day in the winter months, that floor is going to heat up during the day. And at night, when the night comes, there's still energy inside of that floor. And as the night goes on, it's going to release that warm temperature out into the house, and it'll be like a mini heater of sorts, you can think of it as, throughout the day. If you have something like carpet or something like that that lacks thermal mass, you're not going to have that slow release during the day, and it's not going to capture as much energy inside of the house. So the most fundamental principle for why we're building passive is why waste energy? Why use more energy than you need to? There's so many different ways, like some of these that we discussed, for you to bring, for you to capture the energy that's freely coming from the environment, like sun, without having to do something like burning oil or natural gas or using electricity. So really the core principle to me in wanting to build a passive house and for my family is we want to use as little energy as possible, to heat and cool this house and to power all of our appliances and things like this. And that's a foundational principle I would say that I have, is wanting to use, while I'm on Earth, as little materials and resources as possible, and especially for non-renewable resources. If resources are non-renewable, I believe we should only be using those resources very, very sparingly. So if it takes 1 billion years for oil to form, I don't think we should use the oil to drive, a tenth of the mile down the street to go get something. That we should use that for applications that really need that to have that type of energy. But for most other things, for 95% of other applications, we should be trying to use as little resources as possible and to use renewable resources whenever we can. Another one of the primary foundational values that I have that make me want to do this is I am cheap and want to spend as little money as I possibly can when it makes sense. So, for instance, in Colorado we have the sun, shining on us most of the time, and I want to use as much of the sun's energy for free as I possibly can and use as little, burning of natural gas or using electricity to heat my house as possible. We are going to live in this house, potentially until the end of our lives, which may be, for me, another 30, 40, 50 years down the road from now. So if that's the case, I want to have those 30 or 40 or 50 years, using as little energy as possible. Another one of the values that I have that make me want to have a passive house is I like to live in comfort. So I've really enjoyed, when I was growing up, there was a pair of scissors that had been thrown through the window in my bedroom, and we had saran wrap covering that window. And that was there from the time I was in first grade until I moved out of that house when I was a late teenager. And that was a really, really drafty area of the house. There was a very easy exchange of temperature with saran wrap on the window. I want to live in a really comfortable home, and a passive house has unparalleled quality of living. Some of the ways that a passive house is really comfortable are we're going to have triple pane windows, and these windows are going to make it so even if you're right next to the window in the middle of winter, it won't be a very meaningful temperature change from if you're 10 feet away from the window, because it's so energy efficient. The house is going to be at a pretty constant 70 degrees throughout the year without much energy usage, just from naturally, the orientation of the house and, from similar things that I mentioned earlier, like overhangs on the windows and things like that. Another area that I believe this house will really shine in is not being dependent on the grid as much. I am not a conspiracy theorist in the sense that I think it's terrible to be connected to the grid. I think the grid is a incredible luxury that we have. It's backup power, for all of us. Whenever we need it, on-demand power. And viewed through that lens, the grid is an amazing thing. But as we're seeing from places like California, out to the west, sometimes the grid goes out, and that wasn't really something that I saw very often in my childhood, but in California it's becoming quite common. If we use the grid, like the water grid and the power grid, as a backup source, then it's an incredible luxury that we have, that I would be happy to pay, a monthly fee to have. But viewed as the primary means of electricity or the primary means of water, I think we can improve upon that.
Thanks for joining today. Join next time for a quick tour of the house.